April 18th, 1943. The humid winds over the Solomon Islands carried more than the scent of the ocean. They carried fate. The Pacific War had reached a turning point. Japan, once unstoppable, now found itself bleeding across every front. At the heart of this struggle stood one man, Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto was no ordinary officer. To his men, he was the embodiment of Japan's fighting spirit, brilliant, disciplined, and fearless. He had masterminded the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the very strike that had drawn America into the war. But in private, Yamamoto had never wanted this war. He had studied in the United States at Harvard University. He knew America's industrial strength, its factories, its endless capacity to rebuild. Before the attack, he had warned Japan's high command, "For 6 months after war begins, I will run wild. After that, I can promise nothing." Now his grim prophecy was unfolding before his eyes. The Battle of Midway had cost Japan 4 carriers and hundreds of elite pilots. Guadalcanal had turned into a graveyard for the Imperial Navy's best. Yet Yamamoto remained the figure that held the shattered morale of his navy together. His presence inspired discipline. His calm voice on the radio reminded his men that Japan's honor was not yet lost. And so, in April 1943, Yamamoto planned a morale-boosting tour of the front lines, to visit forward air bases, speak to exhausted soldiers, and remind them that the Emperor had not forgotten their sacrifices. It was to be a short trip. 2 bombers, a handful of escort fighters, and a route through the remote jungles of the Solomon Islands. What Yamamoto did not know was that every detail of this trip, every time, altitude, and coordinate, had already been read by the enemy. In a small, windowless room at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy's code breakers had intercepted a routine Japanese message sent in JN-25 code. It looked harmless, an itinerary signed by Yamamoto himself. But when translated, it became one of the most explosive secrets of the war. The message revealed exactly when and where Admiral Yamamoto would be in the air. The news was rushed to Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. When President Franklin Roosevelt saw it, he reportedly said just one sentence: "Get Yamamoto." But the decision was far from simple. If the Japanese discovered that their codes had been cracked, they would change everything, and the Allies would lose their greatest intelligence advantage. Yet letting Yamamoto go meant allowing the symbol of Pearl Harbor to live on. After long debate, the order was given: Operation Vengeance. The plan was daring and nearly impossible. The target area was 400 miles from the nearest Allied base, deep in enemy territory. Only one American aircraft could reach that far and still fight. The twin-boomed Lockheed P-38 Lightning. 18 of them were chosen for the mission, led by Major John Mitchell. At dawn on April the 18th, 1943, the P-38s took off from Guadalcanal. Each pilot carried a photo of Yamamoto. They were told, "You're going after the man who planned Pearl Harbor." Fuel was so limited that every turn, every climb had to be calculated to the second. They flew at wave-top height, less than 50 feet above the sea, to avoid detection by Japanese radar. Far to the north, Yamamoto's 2 G-4M Betty bombers rose from Rabaul Airfield at exactly 6 a.m. They were escorted by 6 Zero fighters. Inside the first bomber, Yamamoto sat calmly in his crisp white uniform, reviewing his schedule, unaware that his every move had already been decided by fate. He spoke softly to his staff. Some later said he looked strangely peaceful that morning, as if he somehow sensed what awaited him. By 9:30 a.m., the American formation had reached Bougainville Island. Their fuel gauges were already dangerously low. Then, through the haze, Lieutenant Rex Barber spotted 2 small glints in the sky, the Betty bombers, right on schedule. Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio. "All right, boys, this is it." Let's make it count. Barber and Lanfear split off to intercept. The Japanese formation was flying in a lazy V pattern. The bombers low, the Zeros above. Lanfear dove first, firing a burst that scattered the escorting fighters. Barber lined up behind the lead bomber, Yamamoto's plane. At 400 yards, he opened fire. Streams of 50 caliber rounds tore through the Betty's right engine. Smoke gushed out. The bomber lurched violently. Inside, chaos erupted. Alarms screamed, glass shattered, and the cabin filled with the smell of burning oil. Yamamoto reportedly stayed calm, his hand gripping the sword on his lap. A second burst hit the left wing. Flames engulfed the fuselage. The bomber dipped sharply, skimming the treetops before exploding in a flash that sent smoke spiraling into the sky. The second bomber tried to escape, but was quickly hit and crash-landed in the jungle. It was all over in less than 10 minutes. The American pilots turned for home, but their ordeal wasn't done. Fuel was almost gone. They flew in silence, each man praying that the ocean below wouldn't become his grave. Hours later, one by one, the P-38s limped back to Guadalcanal. Only one plane was lost. Operation Vengeance had succeeded. Meanwhile, deep in the Bougainville jungle, Japanese search teams scoured the wreckage. By late afternoon, they found the first crashed bomber, twisted, smoking metal tangled in trees. Inside, they discovered Admiral Yamamoto, still seated in his chair, his white gloves unburned, his sword by his side. He had been killed instantly by 2 bullets, one through the shoulder, one through the head. The body was treated with reverence. Soldiers wept openly. They built a bamboo shelter over the crash site and guarded it through the night. When the news reached Rabaul, even hardened officers stood in silence. The empire had lost its greatest naval mind. For days, Japan kept the news secret. Even the emperor was informed privately. Finally, weeks later, Tokyo announced Yamamoto's death. Not as a loss, but as a symbol of eternal loyalty. Across the nation, schools, factories, and temples fell silent. The man who had struck America at Pearl Harbor had himself been struck down from the sky. But behind the sorrow, questions began to rise. Who fired the fatal shots? And had the Americans risked everything to kill a single man? Those questions would follow this mission forever, dividing the men who flew it and shaping the legend of the Pacific skies for decades to come. The jungle was silent that night, except for the distant hum of insects and the faint crackle of fires still burning from the crash. Under the dim light of lanterns, Japanese soldiers gathered around what remained of Admiral Yamamoto's plane. They wrapped his body in white cloth and stood in quiet formation. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The following morning, an officer climbed the nearby ridge and lit a ceremonial flame. It was both a signal and a promise. Japan would never forget the man who had carried its fate. The emperor ordered 3 days of mourning. Naval bases across the Pacific lowered their flags. Every sailor, every pilot, and every ship bore black ribbons. But beneath the ceremony lay something deeper: fear and disbelief. If Yamamoto, the most guarded man in the Imperial Navy, could be killed in the sky, then no one was safe. Meanwhile, on Guadalcanal, the American pilots of Operation Vengeance returned as quiet heroes. They were forbidden to speak of their mission. No newspapers reported their success. No medals were awarded, at least not immediately. The mission itself was so secret that even their commanding officers were told to say nothing. The United States could not risk revealing that it had broken Japan's codes. Major John Mitchell, Captain Thomas Lanfear, and Lieutenant Rex Barber went back to routine combat duty, carrying with them the burden of silence. Yet among themselves they knew they had changed the course of the Pacific War. But a shadow followed their success, Almost immediately, an argument broke out among the pilots who had fired the fatal shots that brought down Yamamoto's bomber. Lanfear claimed credit, saying his attack had crippled the plane first. Barber insisted it was his burst that set the bomber ablaze. For decades, historians debated it, examining gun camera footage, flight paths, and bullet patterns. Even today, the argument remains unresolved, a reminder that even in victory, war breeds rivalry. Across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence officers worked desperately to understand what had happened. They found no evidence of radar interception, no ship reports. To them, it was as if the Americans had simply appeared out of the sky at the exact time and place of Yamamoto's flight. Eventually, suspicion turned toward the impossible, that the Americans might have broken Japan's most secure naval code. That suspicion was correct. Within weeks, Japan changed portions of its cipher system, but by then, it was too late. The Allies already had the momentum, and Yamamoto's death accelerated Japan's decline. Without his strategic guidance, the Imperial Navy grew increasingly fragmented. New commanders lacked his balance between aggression and realism. They believed in glory rather than survival. As 1944 began, Japan's naval defeats multiplied. Carrier after carrier was sunk. The once proud combined fleet became a shadow of its former self. In Tokyo, Yamamoto's portrait hung draped in black cloth, a silent witness to the unraveling of an empire. Back in the United States, the story of Operation Vengeance finally emerged months later. The public was stunned. Newspapers printed Yamamoto's name in bold letters. The master of Pearl Harbor is dead. For many Americans, it was justice, the Avengers' hand reaching across the ocean to strike down the man who had humiliated their nation. Yet, inside military circles, the mood was more complex. Some officers feared that killing Yamamoto would only harden Japan's resolve. Others believed it was a necessary blow, one that removed a genius who might have prolonged the war. President Roosevelt said little publicly, but in private, he called the mission a fitting end for the man who planned Pearl Harbor. In Japan, the propaganda machine transformed Yamamoto's death into legend. Posters appeared with his image surrounded by flames and cherry blossoms. Children were taught that he had died in battle, sword in hand, fighting for the emperor. His ashes were carried back to Tokyo under heavy guard. At his funeral, tens of thousands lined the streets. Bells tolled. The emperor himself posthumously promoted him to Marshal Admiral of the Navy. Even his enemies, American officers and pilots, admitted respect. They called him a soldier's soldier, a man who fought with honor even when he disagreed with the war itself. But beyond the ceremonies, something changed inside Japan's leadership. Without Yamamoto, no one could unify the Navy and Army. Rivalries deepened, logistics collapsed, the war became increasingly desperate. In the jungles and on the seas, American forces continued their advance. The same skies that had witnessed Yamamoto's fall now roared with B-29 bombers heading toward Tokyo. The tide had turned completely. Still, the men who flew Operation Vengeance remembered that day differently. It wasn't triumph they recalled, but silence. The silence of a jungle after gunfire fades. The silence of a man who had once commanded fleets, now lying among the wreckage. Some of them wondered if justice and revenge had become the same thing. Years after the war, when historians asked Major Mitchell about the mission, he simply said, "We didn't think of it as killing a man. We thought of it as ending a war sooner." But he paused, then added, "Yamamoto was a warrior, and every warrior deserves respect." In the Pacific today, near the island of Bougainville, the wreckage of Yamamoto's bomber still lies among the trees. Corroded metal, fragments of glass, and the faint outline of wings swallowed by the jungle. A small memorial stands nearby, maintained by both Japanese and local islanders. Visitors come, some in silence, some in prayer. On quiet mornings, when the wind moves through the palms, it feels as though the echoes of that April day still linger. The drone of engines, the sudden roar of gunfire, and the moment when history shifted course forever. For the Americans, Operation Vengeance was a symbol of precision, courage, and retribution. For Japan, it was the loss of a guiding hand, a strategist who had known that war against the United States was unwinnable. And for the world, it stood as a chilling reminder that even the greatest of commanders can be brought down not by chance, but by intelligence, patience, and the relentless march of fate. Admiral Yamamoto's legacy endures, not as the man who struck Pearl Harbor, but as the man who foresaw the storm he could not escape, and flew straight into it with the calm of a samurai who understood his destiny.